Hello. Well, as you can probably see from the title, this is going to be a spicy video. I have not made these sorts of videos before. I do realize they're very popular on YouTube, but I have not done so up till now. But I felt like it was important to do. So I'll start by saying that I think Mouthy Infidel is dishonest. He uses this sort of dishonest tactic in his debates. It is no longer the case that we are discussing or debating ideas in good faith, but a sort of attempt to, or his style is an attempt to bury you with details, leave out details that do not help his case, and in the cases I'll discuss in this video, outright lie in his approach to kind of give like a complete package where you have some truths, some lies, and in total it looks like a very compelling kind of message. I recently saw a debate between Mouthy Infidel and JF, who is this French-Canadian YouTuber, I suppose. And he's known for being like a sort of social Darwinist. And this whole debate kind of really upset me because it was very strange. On the one hand, you have someone like Mouthy Infidel saying, I like socialism, but in fact, capitalism is pretty much built into my understanding of what socialism is. And on the other side, you have a social Darwinist saying, yeah, we like capitalism because it kills off the wrong people. Like, it was just insane. So what I would like to do now is I'd like to go over Mouthy's side of the debate, analyze it, see which parts are truthful, which parts are not so truthful, and just, I don't know, trash talk, in quotes, in quotation. Anyway, so let's start.
Okay, cool. So I guess I'll go over like my opening statements and I'll kind of try and address where I disagree with JF a little bit on some of the points. So I think there are a few reasons why capitalism, specifically the sort of free market capitalism with, little to no social welfare and so on, that I believe JF advocates for, would not be a sound way to maximize societal utility, so to speak. So, for one, a free market distributes economic resources based solely on the marginal productivity of each unit of capital and labor in an economy.
So this is the first lie. So the idea is that a capital economy distributes wealth. Capital economy does not distribute wealth at all. It is not a fixed pie where you need to distribute it across people who are deserving or some who are not deserving. There are people who produce some things and everyone produces something and then people trade what they've produced. If you go into a job, you get a wage, you produce something in that job, you take the money you earn from the wage and you buy something like a loaf of bread that someone else produced. So it isn't the case that distributes any damn thing. And the other thing is, and Mouth is going to get into this a bit later, is that this definition of capitalism means that some people are excluded, specifically children and the elderly. Now, just to add, the elderly, even in this context, the elderly do have their own capital, they have their own savings, and the children do have capital distributed from their parents. And in addition to that, under capitalism, you do have things like non-profits, charities that do distribute wealth in the same context, although I don't believe it is distributing, but in this context, distribution happens in this way. Anyway, let's continue.
Which will produce massive levels of economic inequality for a few reasons. For one, Around half of the population neither works nor owns a considerable amount of capital, meaning their true factor income is around $0. Two, there are considerable productivity differences between different jobs, which means high wage differences. And three, capital is distributed extremely unevenly, which is and so capital payments are very unequal. Economic inequality tends to be bad for a number of reasons. For one, because people's desires and estimations of their quality of life is relative to this society that surrounds them.
In that case, people in socialist countries must be extremely happy because everyone is extremely poor and extremely equal in their income.
Having high economic inequality leaves significant amounts on the lower end of that distribution to suffer unnecessarily.
Here is a conflation between not having wealth and suffering. So his whole system is built on utilitarianism, meaning people shouldn't suffer, but the only metric he has for that is less money equals suffering and more money equals happiness. There isn't like I'm very poor but very happy, or I'm very rich but very unhappy. It's very specifically tied to money, or in some cases availability to healthcare.
Additionally, it's just an inefficient allocation of resources due to the fact that it allocates crazy disproportionate amounts of resources to people who are already very rich and benefit very little from receiving them in terms of marginal utility.
So again, we have the fixed pie fallacy here, that money comes into the pie and is distributed unequally amongst people. I mean, if one person gets it, another person does not, because it's fixed. And in addition, he's applying marginal utility, which is something that Marxians wouldn't necessarily use because it came after Marx, and it kind of like attacks the labor theory of value.
While leaving considerable amounts of people completely economically screwed. Also, economic inequality can be shown to lead to a variety of other adverse outcomes, such as worse economic growth.
I have not heard anything like that. I think he's lying here or stretching the truth very much, or even if he has something that says that is true, I'd like to see it, because that makes not a lot of sense unless he's comparing African countries that have a lot of economic inequality and very low growth.
Increased crime, decreased social cohesion, worse mental health, etc.
Again, I would say pretty much pulling it out of his ass. I would say with regards to crime, I have several studies, Harvard studies, that says that an increase in welfare increases property crime. Two Harvard studies in the US and one in Europe as well.
Another issue with this free market capitalist society is that, again, about half of all people don't work and shouldn't work. This includes children, the disabled, the elderly, caretakers, etc. And this is actually, by and large, why the poverty rate, at least in the US, is as high as it is. A system that distributes solely on the basis of market income is a society that creates very high levels of poverty.
Absolutely no connection between what he said, and it's not really mentioned here, but as we'll go on, he's going to conflate income inequality with poverty as synonymous.
Due to the fact that about half the population is locked out of receiving a market income. Additionally, the system that JF advocates for produces a high level of alienation, which is substantially harmful to people's well-being. Studies have shown internationally somewhere from 70 to 80% of workers, according to Gallup at least, feel disengaged with work, which so many people spend so much of their life at.
So here we have the second Marxian theory in the talk, alienation. This is a survey done in businesses for people in businesses, and I would take it with a pinch of salt. I can also very easily say, well, I could be more engaged at work. I'm on a scale of 1 to 10. If I'm not super engaged at work, therefore it's a negative. But this is more like I would say a tweaking factor for companies to say, look, if you have more engaged workers, then you will get more productivity out of them. They'll be happier. You'll be richer. So it's a win-win situation. So this is the sort of thing where you would read in business schools and about how to be a better manager, not a critique of capitalism.
which is correlated to a lack of control and influence over the business that they work at. There's also the problem of the non-correspondence between what's profitable and what's overall good for humanity. So like if you create a Venn diagram, there's certainly overlap between what's good for society and what's profitable. For example, I would say like my clothes were profitable for someone to produce and they happen to be useful. But there's a significant amount of non-overlap as well. In other words, if something is profitable to do and not good for humanity, it's pursued by companies. And if something is good for humanity but not profitable, it is not pursued by companies, which leads to substantial net harm being done to societies.
So this is an interesting point being raised here. So in general, there's a theory of what profit is, which I'm not gonna get into here, but more or less it's to do with if you want to make a profit, you need to make people happy or make their lives better, then they will agree to pay you money, and that is the only way to get money, especially long term. So if it is profitable for companies, in a sense, anything could be profitable for companies as long as government doesn't step in the way, in the sense of making it more difficult to start companies and start working in particular sectors, or the barrier to entry is higher due to government. And again, we've kind of skipped over the whole area of people helping people in the terms of non-profits, because non-profits is kind of ignored completely with this Marxian analysis of a society or an economy even. So what could be the case is that people can join forces, freely associate, like let's say people in a town, they can't get the local internet service provider to lay a cable all the way to them because they're so remote. So what they can do is they can, put all the money together, pay someone to lay a cable from the nearest internet exchange to them, split the cost between the town, or get the town can get a loan to that if they all vote on it together. And then, you could freely once it's paid, freely put wireless throughout the whole town so everyone has internet access. This has been done before, and it's just another way of showing that people can solve problems together without the involvement of the government, taking their money, using it very inefficiently. And when I say inefficiently, Mouthy already admitted that the government is not interested in being profitable. Therefore, it is not interested in being efficient with the money to be profitable either. The efficiency of the money is of no concern because it can just make more, take more. So it is preferred if people can help each other. That will be the best route, in my opinion.
So a socialist society that redistributes wealth through welfare, puts ownership in the hands of the public through a social wealth fund and nationalization of certain industries, as well as encouraging sectoral unions and perhaps some co-determination policy, would take care of all of its members, not produce gross economic inequality, align economic decision making with the good of society, and wouldn't produce pervasive and soul crushing alienation.
But it's entirely still capitalism. There's still capitalism. It's not gone. There's no workers owning the means of production. People can still get rich, but they can't get rich as much as they have done before. So how exactly is this socialism? I have no idea.
So I guess that's like my pitch. In terms of where I disagree with some of what JF says, he made the argument that redistribution causes dependency. I'm not sure if that holds a lot of empirical weight. Studies have repeatedly found that of all the recipients of welfare, almost like 100% of them are either working or have a family member who's working.
Okay, so here is another lie. Jeff potentially could have been talking about what's called a welfare trap, which is when you've received welfare, if you start working and you don't earn as much, then the welfare would stop due to the fact that you're working, and then you would actually be losing money if you start working. So it's very common. It's available on Wiki. And what Mouthy is doing here is saying, well, we're taking again the poverty and income inequality as synonymous, and the people who get money, or what's called families that are struggling, and again, families that are struggling is more the income inequality than it is outright poverty. He's just mixing things around and frankly being very dishonest about it.
Studies have found, like behavioral economic studies have found that, I think from a study from Moffitt, that the work disincentive effects of poverty affect its let me rephrase that. The anti-work incentive effects of welfare reduce its anti-poverty effect by about approximately 0%. As far as the idea that like public schools are bad, I guess, this just doesn't really happen to be true. Studies have repeatedly found that public schools are cheaper and lead to better outcomes than private schools.
Wow. This is shocking. So now apparently the public schools in America that fail poor communities, that kids in those schools come out with barely able to read, barely any literacy, barely able ability to do math. Now they are really good, especially compared to private, or I would say charter schools. But I think JF later commented that he didn't even make that comparison. He made the comparison between homeschooling, that during the lockdowns that parents started homeschooling, and untrained parents were better than trained union public teachers. This is such a in-your-face lie that it's just shocking.
In terms of quality, as far as like higher taxes and stuff leading to more corruption, this also doesn't happen to be true. If we look at like the 10 least corrupt countries in the world, according to the Transparency International's ranking, on average collect like 23.64% of their GDP in taxes, while the 10 most corrupt countries for which there is data available collect only 14.5% of their GDP in taxes, according to the World Bank.
So I think what JF was meant in his talk, which I'm not playing here, was with regards to regulatory capture, where companies get very comfy or friendly with the regulator to pass certain laws that either help that company or help that company get rid of the competition. Even if it comes at a slight cost to them, it completely gets rid of the competition. And I think Mouthy's counter to this is basically, again, take the European countries with the highest rates of tax, compare them to, and are not corrupt, and compare them to the African countries that are corrupt and don't have a high tax. Oh, look, there's no connection. It's like, well, regulatory capture is very much a thing, and something, and people who deal with corruption look at it very much.
Central government expenditure as a percentage of GDP is twice as high in the least 10 corrupt countries compared to in the 10 most corrupt countries for which there is data. Even if we take the whole world as a sample, we find a positive relationship between government size and institutional quality. The correlation between total tax revenues as a share of GDP and institutional quality being 0.34. And the correlation between total government consumption as a share of GDP and institutional quality being 0.39.
So notice a few things here. If you're listening to this not through my commenting on it, you are gone. That's it. You cannot retain any more information. You're either, if you're on Mouthy's side, you're either repeatedly nodding your head till your neck hurts, or you are upset that it sounds like he's done a lot of research and he has a very strong case. You've basically been overloaded by details here. And again, he's comparing African countries that may not have a very strong infrastructure, certainly not the rules of law, and with established countries that have more established institutions and whatnot. But saying that a bigger government doesn't lead to more corruptions in the term of regulatory capture, again, that is insane. But he's just thrown so many numbers at you, you don't know what to do with it. But again, we're not discussing the ideas anymore. It's just tactics, and dirty tactics as well at that.
I'm not sure. I was kind of confused by this argument about how it leads to unproductivity. If we look at the specific institutions that I'm advocating for example, unions, taxes, and social welfare policies, these kinds of things have been repeatedly empirically found to actually spur growth.
Yeah, another shocking one. So unions, high taxes, and high social welfare policies spur economic growth. Not sure where to begin with that. Unions, at the very least in this context, are a sort of, to put it not so lightly, government cartel, in a sense that they are banding together and increasing the prices in the same way a bunch of companies would band together like a cartel and increase their prices. So I don't know how increased prices increases economic growth, unless you know prices, because it's a sort of inflation on if the product that the union is in is making. If the prices of that product goes up, then it's a sort of inflation. And if you mean is inflation a sort of economic growth, then maybe, but I'm not sure I would consider that. Taxes, again, like you are taking money out of the economy through taxes, through productive areas of the economy, and putting it into the government and doing things which are necessarily unproductive, but that's not your goal. It's to do something else than being economically productive. So just on principle, that doesn't make any sense. And I think what is going to make soon the case that the social welfare policies increase entrepreneurial companies to start up and innovations, but I have a point on that as well.
I'm not convinced that we need to allocate all of these resources towards people who are already rich so they can continue innovating, especially when we know that social welfare redistributive policies do things like increase the numbers of startups, because there are a lot of people who would be innovative but don't get to realize their innovative capacity because they're afraid if they lose their job, then they'll lose their healthcare or something like that. I know Gareth Olds has done a lot of good work on this, showing that social welfare policies increase startups.
Right, so what he neglected to say here is that the countries that he's advocating for in the Nordic model, so like Sweden, Norway, they have incredibly high youth unemployment, and they also have very low immigrant labor participation. And this is partly due to the fact that the wages are very high. There's unions throughout both, very large unions throughout those countries, and which surprisingly, the unions don't actually get any government protection. There's just the unions versus the companies directly, and because it makes it more expensive to hire someone, including like someone that just came out of university that has no experience. So to add a job for a young person is very difficult in those kind of societies or economy, sorry, and as a result, some of those people, in order to find any work, they need to create their own startup. Otherwise, they won't have nothing. They'll have several years passing without any ability to gain experience in the job market, so on and so forth. So they are necessarily forced to start their own company. Now, if, for example, you're saying that to some degree you're imagining that if there's security in case your startup fails, so you don't have to worry too much. I mean, that's an okay point. But at the same time, if you were able to raise capital, then you're able to put some of that aside in case something happens. To the same degree, you can say that to start a company in a country that has high taxes is a sort of attack on the risk that you are taking. So if, for example, you're risking capital and things do work out, let's say, then 50% of your taxes will go away to the government. Although I think that in those countries they're relatively okay with taxing companies, but very not okay with taxing individuals. So If you are taking on that risk and you get a reward from that risk, you get to keep barely any of it, meaning the risk isn't really worth the attempt. And you may as well just become or stay a perm employee, because you get all these benefits anyway. You don't have to take any risk. You just, even if you do earn a lot of money, it would be heavily taxed. So what is the point? But here in these kinds of countries, because you're unable to find any companies, that's why you need to create your own.
There was a study which found that from Policy and Society, which found that more social spending policies show a positive correlation or a positive causal relationship with innovation.
So I had to research this. The thing is, the definition of innovation is different. The makeup of what constitutes an innovative country is how many people have master's degrees, undergraduate, PhDs, how many patents they file, all these sorts of elements. And to some degree, like you have all these metrics, but at the same time, we all know like where most of the innovation comes from. It is the US. I mean, a lot of our day-to-day stuff is from the US, certainly in terms of tech companies that we use often, and perhaps like certain mobile phones and things of that nature. So, I mean, sure, I mean, you could say that they're innovative, but they're innovative by some sort of artificial metrics and not by how many goods sold from that country. So, for example, if you can think of anything that you buy specifically from Sweden, like what comes to mind would probably be IKEA. A few things comes to mind about some companies that deliver certain software that I'm familiar with in that region. But all in all, it's not large countries as well. But if, for example, you have an idea from those countries, you may just not start a company there or save your idea, move to America, open a company there, and then sell your product there, because you'll get more reward for your work. And to some degree, I would say that to get innovation in countries, a very big, and I would say widely agreed upon a bit of, let's say, principle, is the better the stronger the property rights and the stronger the intellectual rights in a particular country, the more innovation you will see from that country. Certainly, the US led this idea in 1790, or around the time when they were writing the Constitution. There were intellectual property rights built in. And America went from a largely agrarian society to a very innovative country in a relatively short span of time. I think by the end of the 19th century, they're already highly industrialized. So I don't really agree with this point.
Across OECD countries, even accounting for other factors and so on. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's like an okay story, but I just don't see anything JF is saying like being borne out empirically.
Right. Lastly, this empirically, JF has failed to do this. I don't see this in the data. Well, you're not really looking at the data, are you? You're just trying to make up a story that fits your narrative. You're not trying to find the truth of what is going on. Now, maybe you could say the same to me, but at the very least, I'd like to have a civil conversation, maybe even in a debate about ideas. What is right? What is wrong? Not about what is posturing, what is tactics to make the other person look bad. I don't know. It's not as interesting. Maybe some people like that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm missing the bit where JF responds, but his response is outright disgusting. It's basically he's saying, he's giving a squirrel example, and he's saying if you feed the squirrels nuts and they're not, they don't need to survive, they don't need to work hard for those nuts, then you'll increase the population, or they'll be dependent on you, or you'll increase the population of bad in quotation squirrels, and this is basically what capitalism solves. Like it kills off the squirrels, and like, and I just couldn't believe what I'm hearing. Like the idea of capitalism is that it helps human flourishing because it allows humans to be free to pursue their happiness, free to innovate, free to think, free to work in whatever they want. And even in JF's like idea of evolution where there's like sort of like environmental stresses, so only the strongest survive. We've had like a abundance of food for like some years now, so I don't exactly know what environmental pressures are there on the human race, and it's not necessarily like we need to worry about these sorts of things, because all we do need to worry about is perhaps if you have like is for us to have in each field a handful of experts that can move the field forward across many different fields, so we keep progressing technologically and scientifically, and make those discoveries available to everyone in the world. So I don't know. Anyway, the whole JF thing was not something I can get behind at the very least. So I'll put now Mouthy's reply to JF's comments.
Okay, so a few things. So I think you said there's a problem with socialism and that the government can get people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. The problem here is that I think this is actually a good thing. So, for example, we can see that most people by themselves wouldn't just choose to like give money to charity, or at least give enough money to charity.
Okay, so if I recall correctly, Jeff was saying that if you want people to help one another, then just ask them, or they can volunteer to do so. And Mouthy is saying, no, I think it's better that they're forced. And here he's going to say that because the government is so big and can take so much taxes and has a lot of resources due to what it takes, then it can do more than charities can do. And I think he'll speak about charities later on. But even in this example, I actually I believe this, but I actually researched it, and it turns out not to be true. So there's 2 points here I'd like to make. Public social spending in the US is, I think for 2019, is 18.7% of GDP. Now I was thinking private would be way low, but no, it's actually not that far off. It's 12.6% of GDP. So obviously 6.6% difference. But there is a study conducted about government efficiency, and this is important to this point, that how much money from the taxes that are collected end up in the pockets of welfare recipients, both from the public system, so also government welfare, and private charities. And it turned out on average, and again I'm using averages here, that the government keeps around 70% of the taxes it collected for itself for administrative overheads and whatnot. And I don't mean like keep in its pocket, pays its very large bureaucracy or number of contractors or whatnot. And charities who are much more efficient with that money, because they're essentially competing for people's contributions, and if they are inefficient with that, they will lose those contributions. So on average, it's 30% is lost in quotations to administrative overhead and infrastructure. Now, if you take that 70-30 split and apply it to that money, you would find out that the money that actually people receive from the government after collected from tax is about 5.6% of GDP. And with charities, it's 8.82% of GDP. So I, after doing some research and not believing Mouthy, I started to realize that these numbers are not entirely true.
But when the government forces people to give money to support poor people, then that actually leads to a positive outcome. This is why private spending and private charity hasn't actually been seen to correlate with reductions in poverty.
So what Mouthy is doing here is that he's conflating poverty and income inequality. What he's essentially saying is that charities do not change income inequality, which is to some degree true, because that's not something they're going after, and governments do. So the thing is this, and to some degree, like you can also say that there isn't always an overlap from the point of view of something that the government spends for a charity to come in and compete with the government. There's no point they'll compete in something else. But just in terms of poverty itself, I mean, poverty and income inequality, sorry. If you had two people knocking on your door and asking to donate to charity, one of them saying, would you like to contribute to fight income inequality in your area? Or would you like to contribute to fight poverty in your area? whom would you contribute your money to? So I think most of you would say to fight poverty, and that is something that we should be going after to fight poverty, to increase our economic growth to a point where poverty is eliminated, which is something the UN Global that are trying to fight poverty are trying to do. And I don't think this addressing income inequality is necessarily helpful. I don't even think it's what we should be going after. Certainly, poverty is something we should be going after. And here, Mouthy conflates the two constantly. So you don't know if he's talking about poverty in one sense, but he's saying poverty, but he could mean income inequality, or he's saying income inequality, but he could be meaning poverty in a sense which makes his case seem better.
Whereas government welfare does significantly reduce poverty. So I think that if the government can get people to do things through compulsion that they otherwise wouldn't do, and the result of this is that we don't have children living in poverty, and everyone in society or mass swaths of people living in society can be better off and not be doomed to poverty, I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, so Mouthy has a bit of an active imagination here, just trying to conflate his point a bit further. But what I would say, I think I may have forgotten to mention it earlier, is that actually charities are typically, in the case of poverty, typically more effective at government in getting people out of poverty. I have seen studies from charities, obviously, because they are the one that trying to claim that they're efficient with your money, but for argument's sake, they are saying that they are 3 times more effective at getting families. I remember the data was about families out of poverty entirely. Like they needed some help. They had some very specialized help from that particular charity. Had a more hands-on approach, a more community-based approach, I believe. And families were lifted out of poverty 3 times higher at the rate that the government was. So the government kept them. I wouldn't say kept them, but they stayed on government welfare continuously while these people were lifted out of poverty.
You said that capitalism punishes bad decisions, even if your parents made them. That's a good thing. If you don't recall, when I laid out why poverty is as high as it is, it's because of people who are locked out of market income because they're disabled, because they're old, because they're like elderly and can't work, because they're children.
Yeah, so once again, old people typically have savings, children typically have their parents. I mean, obviously there are extreme cases where old people need help, children need help, and parents can provide for them. Certainly, disabled people who aren't able to work need help, but we have that infrastructure. And if you think, in a sense, that the percentage of those people is really very, very low. It's not 50%. It's more like 1 to 3% of the population. Then we are more than capable of helping those people, especially if we have a richer society, a society that's allowed to go out, be productive, make money, to then very easily, it's not even like a very big sacrifice to donate a bit of money to these charities.
Because they're caring for someone else, like in the family. I fail to see how you can connect any of these characteristics with decisions made by these people or made by their parents. And I don't see how letting people live in poverty because they are children or elderly or disabled punishes bad decision making in any way that leads to any sort of positive outcome in society. So I guess you'd have to explain to me how punishing people for circumstances that they have no control over leads to better incentives that create a more flourishing society.
Fuck you, JF, and your fucking squirrels.
I think you said that I don't have a philosophical pillar of what bad things are.
So this was not included in this clip, but it means that because it's utilitarian, you don't have a philosophical principle as to what it is you're looking for. Because if it's something subjective like less pain and less suffering, then less pain and less suffering, more happiness, then it is a very subjective thing, which could mean different things for different people. But I'll let Mouthy continue.
And that productive societies understand this, and the reason we can have socialism is because it's a parasitic grift that lives off the productivity of capitalism.
Now, here is something I would actually agree with JF. Yes, the whole setup that Mouthy is presenting, his socialism is parasitic on the remaining elements of capitalism in that society, and it's by design. So you need capitalism to make money, or you need, let's say, a mass of natural resources in your country to then be nationalized, so you can pay for all these things. It's not something that creates. Obviously, it's not even attempting to create anything. It's something that is necessarily parasitic on the economy doing well. If you have unions, it's to increase the wages of the workers. If you have the government has like a wealth fund, so in this case, he's not exactly explaining it, but there's a wealth fund from a large oil reserve that then buys stocks in other companies, but never 100% of those companies, because you want them to make money. You just want to siphon off the excess to excess is a word he uses. Maybe not in here, but in other places. So it is entirely parasitic, or at the very least rent-seeking from the actual economy or the productive economy.
Well, a few things. I guess my philosophical pillar of what a bad thing is generally what is subjectively not wanted when experienced by people in society, right? This is like the classic definition of pleasure and suffering used by utilitarians like John Stuart Mill. Pleasure is what is wanted when experienced. Suffering is what's not wanted when experienced. And I don't think it has to be any more complicated than that in order for us to create policies aimed at maximizing pleasure and maximizing societal utility.
To be honest, that's actually quite a difficult thing to achieve. Just I want more pleasure, I want less pain is, yeah, it's very, very difficult to calculate, to guess, to predict, to do whatever. I mean, if you're just using things like more money equals more happiness, no matter, like, just like as a sliding scale, the more money the better, the less money the worse, then maybe you could do something with that, because then at least you have some numbers. But otherwise, I see that as actually very difficult philosophically and politically to achieve.
The idea that productive societies are productive because they're capitalistic, and if a productive society has socialism, it's just because of a parasitic grift, doesn't square well with empirical evidence suggesting that redistributive policies actually increase productivity.
Actually, they don't, and even by definition, they don't.
In societies. So, for example, we can look at a study showing that social programs like unemployment insurance increase economic growth.
Now, this is interesting. I have not heard that unemployment insurance outright increases economic growth. At least that's not its main function. It's not my understanding that it's connected, but it might be true. In which case, I mean, there is unemployment insurance available to regular people. I was able to take it out when I was self-employed, and there's even such thing as poverty insurance, where like a town doesn't want any people in their town to become unemployed or somehow get into poverty. So there's poverty insurance where everyone in the town voluntarily chips in a relatively small amount of money compared to what the government may or may not take. And if anyone in the town loses their job or severely, loses a lot of money at one go, for example, then this poverty insurance kicks in. So I mean, there is market opportunities for that, and certainly you could say how much money you want to. If it's employment insurance, you can choose what packages you want, and if the poverty insurance, if the company was acting badly, you can switch it with someone else. So there's more options in the free market for this reason, if it is the case that unemployment insurance increases economic growth.
We can look at studies from OECD and the International Monetary Fund showing that tax and redistribution policies have a positive causal impact on economic growth and economic productivity.
Yeah, so I don't really buy that. I mean, I can appreciate that if a country is able to borrow money to stimulate economic growth, then sure. And certainly that is a Keynesian kind of approach that Mouthy is kind of describing. But that the government takes out money from the economy and just like not being mean or anything, puts it into less productive endeavors by definition, because the market would have been more productive due to competition, efficiency, caring for profit, whereas not caring for it, then yeah, I don't buy it.
Like this argument just doesn't really hold up empirically. You said that welfare is increasing, which means there's dependence. I don't know if that means there's dependence.
So here Mouthy is replying to Jeff, saying that the welfare has gone up. The incline of welfare spending has gone up significantly since the war on poverty started, and it's not looking like the trajectory isn't looking like it's flattening off by any means. So at some point you will actually run out of money. It's not funny, and this is only like the part of the things that the government needs to pay for. So it needs to. So, for example, right now the debt is close to 30 trillion. There's also about 220 trillion worth of pensions that don't need to be paid immediately, but at least they need to be serviced. And so this is in fact a very real concern.
In the sense that people feel more dependent on welfare. I think welfare is generally increasing in the US. In other places, the trajectory isn't exactly the same. But I don't think this is evidence of a bad thing. Because something is increasing over time doesn't therefore mean that it's causing any negative outcomes.
Yeah, so doesn't really know what he's talking about. Doesn't know the significance of how severe the stakes are in this. Doesn't care as long as the argument is won. When everyone is flat broke or we run out of oil money, then yeah, people will then start to care, and then Mouthy may start to care as well.
You said if we could fix injustices with welfare, it would have fixed itself already. The mistake you're making there is that the problems that need to be fixed by welfare aren't like one-time things, and then when we fix them they go away, and the fact that we still have welfare means that it's not effective. The problems which welfare addresses are ongoing problems, like the fact that market income distributions don't distribute income to people who are like children or disabled or elderly, those kinds of things.
So again, he's repeating his previous points. Jeff was kind of saying like, you paid so much money into it that why hasn't it been fixed? And to some degree, things like poverty or generational poverty, if you get people onto jobs and things like that, then they will eventually come out of poverty. And that's kind of the idea. Like, you're supposed to help them get out of poverty, not necessarily keep them there forever. And like, there could well be cases where someone is disabled and cannot work, and for that you do need to keep helping them in an ongoing manner. But at the trajectory that it is at the moment is insane. Like, you can't honestly say that this is a positive thing. We need to spend more money. If the claim was we need to spend money, solve 50 or 70% of it in one large go, then yeah, people may pay towards that. But this is unsustainable, what Mouthy is ignoring.
So we wouldn't expect welfare to fix it as like a one-time thing and then go away. You brought up the point about institutional quality. You said that, like, of course, they correlate with government's involvement because obviously the government has more money. I think you just weren't really understanding what I mean by the metric of institutional quality. So when I'm talking about institutional quality, I'm talking about things like, and this is in the academic literature, we're talking about things like the level of corruption in the government. We're talking about things like rule of law. We're talking about things like government effectiveness. We're talking about things like government accountability.
Sorry, I snorted when he said government effectiveness. So, I mean, to some degree, I would say this. If you're conflating government with all the welfare policies and the things that government does actually well, such as the army, the police, to some degree, not many will agree, but protection services, resolving disputes, justice, and things like that, then technically those things are things that government is efficient at. It does them well, and should do more of them and should tweak them. Obviously, people will argue about the police thing, which I can fully take on those kinds of comments, but I wouldn't mix those with welfare, because the studies show that the welfare the government does is between hopeless and hugely inefficient. So yeah.
Lack of violence, political stability, absence of terrorism, these kinds of things, which are pretty objectively desirable. And if we can show that government size correlates with these kinds of institutional qualities, then I think we can pretty safely conclude that bigger government isn't creating all these kinds of corruptions, which is the claim that you initially made.
I will agree with Jeff here. The bigger the government, the bigger likelihood for corruption. The bigger the government, the more control it has over the people, both political and economic. The less freedoms the people have, the more regulatory capture there can be. Very large governments, you could say, such as the USSR or Mao's China, had a lot of corruptions. I don't think any side of the political spectrum would disagree with that. So I would see a connection with bigger government and corruption. And even specifically an example that Mouthy is recommending, where you have the government buying up stocks in companies so that the profits from those companies go to the whole of the population. Even in that kind of scenario, you have a situation where the government is in bed with large corporations in the economy, and it now suddenly has an interest to protect those companies and pass laws and regulations that secure their investment. So, for example, a real example, the De Beer Diamond Mining Company went into the region of South Africa, and in the case of Botswana, it had an agreement with the government to mine the diamonds there, and the government had a 10% stake in the company, or 15% stake in the company. And De Beers were the diamond monopoly for quite a few decades as a result of this sort of behavior between the government and the private sector. I mean, the government should at best, or ideally, be like a sort of referee. It shouldn't be an active participant or root for one side over the other. Yeah.
So I guess that's like the broad thing. I also you keep going back to this idea of like an inefficient allocation of resources in socialist systems, but I guess I'm not, because you said that that's the point you wanted to emphasize at the beginning, but I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, so that's pretty much it. There is more to the debate, and I'll link it in the description so you can see the whole thing. But for the context of my video, I think this is enough. So just to go over some of the points, even the premise of this debate is wrong, is a lie in a sense, because he's not advocating for socialism. Any Marxian socialist would not be for that. They would see this as a sort of continuation or keeping capitalism on life support indefinitely and will delay the revolution. This is a sort of Nordic model, which is a social democracy. I mean, there are other people that use this exact model. Maybe Mouthy is has a little bit more elements of welfare programs and social wealth funds and whatnot. But I mean, even the examples that he uses, a lot of them is from Norway, and Norway is a small country with 4 million people sitting on a large oil reserve. And yeah, I mean, still, yes, you can do all these things with these oil reserve, but I mean, even now, Norway is heavily dependent on them. I mean, 88% of their GDP is government activities. Of those, are a large amount of those are oil and gas. So, and if you wanted to go for a more accurate social model based on this sort of natural resources plan, then you do have other examples. And I'm sorry if this offends anyone or triggers anyone, but Venezuela is very similar. Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world. The second country ranking after Venezuela has 1/3 the oil that Venezuela does. And it was much more active in its socialist policy. So it had 100,000 co-ops. It took agricultural land away from the rich and gave it to the poor. It nationalized, obviously, the oil sector. It nationalized some banks, some companies in the finance industry. It helped people set up their own kind of companies and funded them, like even if they were losing money, to compete against private companies. There's even like a video of Chavez going around and says, "What's this place? Expropriate it." It's like, this is much more consistent with socialism, and we know what the result is, even with oil. Now, Norway, for example, hasn't spent all its money as frivolously as Venezuela did, because Venezuela funded a lot of programs. It gave oil very cheaply to its citizens, whereas Norway, everything is very, very expensive. The oil is expensive, the food is expensive, the rent is expensive, and the salaries aren't all that to compensate for that. Even I mean, as a disclosure, we have family in Norway. I've been going there back and forth for about 12 years, and even now, like, we buy some things here in the UK. We package them and we send it to Norway because it's cheaper to do that than purchase stuff in Norway. What is also really funny is that it's not in the clip, but in the other part of the debate, Mouthy goes on about how evil companies are ruining the earth to make a profit. I mean, the whole setup of this socialist example that you're giving is based on fossil fuels. I mean, just because the private sector does it, it's evil. But when the government does it, the oil no longer harms the planet. It's fine. It's just a lot of contradictions. And to be fair, like, that's one of the things that it actually does make it Marxian, all those contradictions. But yeah. Anyway, not honest. Don't trust the statistics. Keep trying to find the truth. And yeah, thank you for watching the entire hour-long video. I appreciate it very much. And I hope not to make too many of these sorts of videos in the future. Bye.